Penguin Random House Canada presents What She Said, Conversations About Equality by Elizabeth Renzetti. Read for you by the author. For Maud, Griff, and Doug. Introduction. The message arrived as I was putting on my boots on a sunny winter afternoon. "Hey," my friend texted. "What are you up to?" I tapped out a quick response. "Going to the Women's March." Perhaps I also added an embarrassing selection of exclamation marks and emojis. I leave that to your imagination. "Oh," my friend texted back. "Are we still doing that?" Fair question, I thought. And also, hell yes, we're still doing that. How many of these protests had I been to in my life? Later, as I sidled through the marchers gathered on a slushy Toronto sidewalk, I was reminded why I was still there. And it was not because I liked having someone yell, 2468 in my ear through a megaphone. It was, instead, to understand on a gut level how far we still had to go. Every person in that crowd, every sign, told the story of a job unfinished, of wage gaps, exploited workers, silenced survivors. 6 years earlier, it had felt like we were all on the streets. I had joined hundreds of thousands of protesters for the Women's March in Washington, D.C. in 2017, the crowd fired up by the recent election of a bigot and misogynist to the most powerful political office in the world. My feet froze, but my heart thawed as I checked my phone and saw millions of women marching in towns and cities around the world. The politely seething crowd had gathered on the Mall to hear Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem remind us that the fight for women's freedom was like the paddle wheel on a steamer, constantly churning against the tide. I walked past an older woman carrying a sign that said, "I can't believe I still have to protest this shit," and I thought, me neither, sister, me neither. After that Women's March in Washington, I went back to the Toronto newsroom where I worked as a journalist for the Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper, and wrote stories and columns about how perhaps we were seeing a new dawn. The Me Too movement was nascent, women were running for public office in record numbers, Gal Gadot was Wonder Woman. What more could we want? But the new dawn was really just the headlight on a train that wanted to mow us down. Almost 7 years later, there is a chasm between where we should be, equality for people of all genders, races, and abilities, and where we actually are, which is a world backsliding towards authoritarianism and inequality. We are experiencing a powerful backlash to women's advancement, very much like the one Susan Faludi identified in her seminal 1991 book of the same name. We are in a strange, uncomfortable space at the moment where feminism's goal of equality exists as a commodity, a fashion item, a necessary upheaval in art and culture, but not yet as reality. Especially not for women who are racialized, who are poor, who are queer or trans, who do not fit the definition of able-bodied. It is these gaps between where we are and where we hope to be that I explore in this book. But first, a story. In 1993, I was a baby feminist working as an editor at the Globe and Mail when suddenly a new column appeared in its pages. A men's column. No, seriously, that's what it was called. Men. How odd, I remember thinking. Some of my friends liked to call the newspaper the Globe and Old White Male, and it was hard to argue with them. Men ran the paper, wrote and edited the majority of its stories, were the subject of most of its articles and photos. Periodically, women in the newsroom would hold boozy gatherings called femfests to plot paths toward a tiny bit more money or power or even just sanity. One of those plans involved floating the idea of a newsroom daycare. An HR executive, a woman, responded by saying we could have a daycare on site when she could bring her pet to work. One particular men's column caused my mercury to skyrocket. The subject was an anti-feminist publication called The Backlash. The title was, of course, appropriated from Faludi's book. Its editor trotted out a familiar line of complaints and gave this gem of a quote. If men don't express their anger and start laughing at some of the stuff being spread by the pop feminists, in a few years there will be a real explosion of male violence and of men oppressing women. With my hair standing on end, I proposed writing a rebuttal to this absurd column. I was not a writer at that point, but electricity crackled out of my fingertips. Had feminism really ruined things for men? On the contrary, I wrote, women suffered high rates of violence, sexual harassment, wage discrepancies. We paid more for our girly pink pens. After my angry response ran, two things happened. Letters of support poured in, and I was offered a regular column. That was 30 years ago. I've been writing variations on that column ever since, the world's longest and most irritating Groundhog Day. I've written about intimate partner violence and pay gaps, the harms done to Indigenous and racialized women by colonial mindsets, childcare and emotional labor, femicide and the underreporting of sexual assault, the Me Too movement and the backlash to it, incel killers, health discrepancies facing women, menopause stigma, period stigma, the hunt for even one wrinkle on the big screen. Well, the list goes on. All of this writing and reporting informed the discussions you'll hear in this book. Nothing ever got fixed, not entirely. A patch would go up over here, a leak would immediately spring over there. Some readers loved these columns, while others thoughtfully opined that I was a man-hating cunt. By the time I wrote my last Globe and Mail column in June 2022, I felt discouraged once again. I'd noticed a destructive zero-sum game developing. One group had to be seen to be winning, another losing. The early men's rights movement and publications like Backlash had morphed into the online manosphere, which fattens on grievance as it straddles the world like a malignant spider. It was this tension that led me to write this book. Is the playing field really level now, as we're told? Really? When women make up half the population but take up only 30% of the seats in Canada's Parliament and 5% of CEO offices? When they make a fraction of the salary of male athletes? Really? When only 1 in 10 sexual assault cases reported to police results in a conviction? When domestic violence, which spiked during the pandemic, continues to increase and intensify? When 3 of the largest mass killings in modern Canadian history were tied to misogyny? When Indigenous women continue to experience violence at shockingly high rates? As I was gathering notes for this book in 2023, my typing fingers became sore. My heart became sore. In Winnipeg, a man with a history of domestic violence was accused of the murders of 4 Indigenous women, whose bodies were allegedly dumped in landfill sites. In Ontario, a coroner's inquest into the murders of 3 women by a former partner recommended that the province declare intimate partner violence an epidemic. Those stories soon disappeared from the headlines. In Iran, schoolgirls were being beaten and poisoned for the crime of protesting a tyrannical government regime. In Afghanistan, they were forbidden from going to school at all. In Mexico and Kenya, women gathered en masse to protest the epidemic of women killing. In France and South Korea, frightening anti-feminist movements gathered strength. Of course, it's not just France and South Korea. In the U.S., the giant whose every movement causes our balanced-on-top country to shudder, women's reproductive rights have been rolled back in a terrifying manner, along with the rights of LGBTQ+ Americans. In 2022, when abortion had been protected by law for nearly 50 years, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, depriving women of the most basic control over their own bodies. Perhaps worst of all, as I write this, the malicious narcissist whose presidency we protested in 2017 is once again the Republican nominee for president. Donald Trump might even succeed, in spite of the criminal charges and accusations that dog him like a leper's bell. Even a slew of sexual assault allegations have failed to deter his devout fans. Deter? Hell, it heats them up. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?